complexity takes on a few angles, and there's nuance to complexity. There's I would say organic complexity, which happens as a result of hopefully valuable things happening within your business, right? And then those complexities, are hopefully beneficial and have a feedback loop to help grow your business. There's also self-inflicted complexity, which often happens when you maybe are too smart for your own good.
Welcome to the Distributed Truth Podcast. Today's B2B SaaS teams all share one thing in common: fragmented customer data. Marketing, sales, customer success, finance, and product teams need better approaches to unified customer data. What does it look like to be data-driven rather than data-inhibited? What is the link between investing in unified customer data and revenue growth? How can we create consistent customer experiences through unified customer data? Join us here at the Distributed Truth Podcast as we interview a wide array of go-to-market, revenue operations, technology, and data leaders, all dedicated to solving the problem of fragmented customer data. Hello and welcome to the Distributed Truth Podcast. I'm your host, Evan Dunn, growth marketing at Syncari, and with me is Joe Reis, speaker, podcaster, and co-author of The Fundamentals of Data Engineering. Thank you for joining us, Joe.
Hi, how's it going?
It's going good. You stylize yourself as a recovering data scientist. What does that mean?
Well, I was a data scientist, and now I'm in recovery. So yeah,
Why do you need recovery?
It was a tough road, a really hard lifestyle. Yeah, I mean, there's where to begin. I got into data science, I would say, well before it was, called data science, and when the term became popularized, in the early 2010s, I noticed there was a big move towards, people wanting to be data scientists, in no small part due to the HBO article on, data science is the sexy job of the 21st century and everything, that captured the public's imagination. But, I think early on what I recognized was, with the rise of data science was also the, a lot of things sort of, I would say being ignored, whether willfully or not, and that was just building a solid foundation of, best practices, I guess buy-in from the business, and also just probably a proper infrastructure in place to support data science, right? So the common trope is data scientists spend 80-90% of their time cleaning data or twiddling their thumbs and trying to find projects to do. And I think after seeing that repeatedly, I think very early on recognized that there's probably a different way to do data than just hiring a bunch of data scientists kind of off the bat and expecting them to do magical data science stuff. So that's why I became a recovering data scientist, I think, fairly early on. In fact, I'm looking at a meme I was just tagged in today where somebody had it's Homer Simpson trying to go to heaven, and then he ends up in hell. And that
I think
path to heaven was data science, and the path to hell is data engineering. And that's my friend Vin commented that was pretty much my resume several years ago, and I tend to agree with that. So,
I like to spend a lot of time on Blind to understand what data teams are feeling right now, especially right. And I've seen a lot of them talk about, the developer persona likes to go on the anonymous version of Glassdoor, right? A lot of them are talking about getting laid off and having a difficult time finding new roles, right? It would follow, in my head, logically, based on what you described, that we just saw a decade of a certain approach to data that got very popular. And that's changing now. Do you agree?
It's changing, and I don't know where it goes yet. That's kind of one of the big question marks, but it is certainly changing, and it's been changing for a bit. I think even before the downturn, I would say, the last few years have sort of seen the, I would say, some second guessing about data science, and an embracement of data engineering, and would say roles that are ancillary and supportive of data science. After spending a lot of money on data scientists and seeing projects fail, I would guess that companies would either cancel the data science projects or try and find maybe a different way of making that succeed. It's not to say that I'm not discounting data science at all. I think it's awesome when it's applied correctly, but the order of operations is typically completely out of whack. So, and I think a lot of companies are starting to see this. So.
Yeah, no, I agree. I've experienced it, but would you mind unpacking just a couple things for listeners, right? What is a data scientist, and what do you mean by that order of operations getting out of whack?
It's a good question. I still struggle with the definition of a data scientist, and I would actually, I'll make a public service announcement. If anyone has a good definition of a data scientist, please let me know. I think that's one of the struggles is like, what is it, right? So, I mean, there's Drew Conway's Venn diagram of data science, back in the day. It was, can't remember exactly what it was, but, it was like maybe stat skills, hacking skills, and like, domain skills or something like that, nunchuck skills. But, and DJ Patil, actually, when he came up with the term data scientist, I read an interview with him several years ago, and he said that they intentionally left it undefined. It was a term, but it wasn't a role per se. It more described sort of this new era of, maybe applying scientific techniques to data for business purposes and so forth, with the rise of big data and so forth. Being able to do something with data was, of utmost importance. When DJ Patil was at LinkedIn, for example, and I thought that was really interesting because he himself intentionally didn't give it a very concrete definition. And so, if the originator of the term hasn't given it a definition, and if we as an industry are still struggling with what the definition is, and I suppose you get what you're seeing, which is
lots of
people are hired.
Yeah.
Well, people are hired for a role for which there isn't a clear definition, right? Whereas if you looked at the definition of a brain surgeon or a neurosurgeon or a cardiovascular doctor or a dentist, for example, a dentist is very clear like what they do, right? And there's dental surgeons and oral surgeons and that kind of stuff, and orthodontists, and these are very discrete fields. Obviously, these fields have been around for a long time, but I also think it speaks to the immaturity of the data field, and not immature in a pejorative sense, but just immature in the fact that it hasn't been around that long, and so practices, and definitions are still. And I guess clarity in general is still TBD. So,
yeah, I'd like to offer a few things I've seen and get a reaction. Right, I mean, data scientist typically has meant I'm interacting with someone who is excellent at either just applied computational math or maybe actually a statistician or physicist by past life, right, and then shifted into these roles. I think it's interesting you point out that there's been a burgeoning of supporting roles, right, in order to do data science and analytics. Now you've got data engineer, data architect, though data architects...
They've been around for ages.
Yeah, they've been...
Data architects. And same with ETL and BI engineers and developers. They've been around for decades, too. I think it's just a repackaging of, what's kind of always been the case.
But there has been a veritable explosion, right, of companies investing in these roles in past years and investing in tools to support these roles, not to mention the VC market around data stack components getting quite massive. It doesn't feel like it's figured it out. If I use the phrase modern data stack, is that okay? Are you yeah.
I mean, I cringe a bit at it, but it's fine.
Tell me why you cringe.
I think it's overblown. I mean, at the end of the day, modern data stack is really at least for me, it's a simplified consumption model of something, again, that has been around for ages, which is data warehousing. The fact that you can consume things in a pay-as-you-go cloud-based format that makes things more convenient, but nothing's really changed, if you know what I mean. Like if you're going to tell me that the modern data stack is a completely new way of doing things, I'll have to question, your sense of history in this field and your perspective. And maybe there are some good arguments that I'm not aware of, but to me, it's nothing new. But what had happened, obviously, over the last decade is, interest rates were zero and data was the new oil, so to speak. And so what do you think is going to happen? There's a lot of companies that sprung up, and I would say a lot of money flowing in, and with that, you need some good marketing. And, modern data stack is maybe a good way of describing a data stack, that also sort of arose over 10 years ago with the rise of Redshift and so forth. So I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. But what I have noticed though, so I've been in data for, over 20 years now, right? And working in a capacity of, I'd say, quote, data scientist for much of that, even though it wasn't called that. But, what back in the day, what I know, the big difference between then and now is, if you were working with data, it was to do something that the business needed you to do. It wasn't like you're hired just for like eye candy, right? Like, oh, look at our data scientist over there. He's like so smart and so cool. Can solve anything. I mean, that wasn't the case back then. It was like, you're hired to just make operations better for, whatever that is, marketing or supply chain or whatever you happen to be working in back in the day, right? And so there wasn't this, focus on data as a field so much as it was just the outcomes you'd be doing, right? And I think that really flipped on its head, where it kind of boggles my mind that, as I always joke back in the day, if you've ever watched that movie Office Space, like data people were much like the guy Milton, the guy with the red stapler who was like shoved into the basement and kind of like forgotten about. Probably was, I don't think it was getting paid either or something like that. But anyway, I don't think data people were that much different back then. It wasn't a popular field. I finished my degree in math, and my options back then was like, go teach, go work in the government. You could become an actuary, which is what I originally wanted to do, or you can go work as an analyst, or you can go wait tables somewhere. There weren't a ton of options, but this is also following on the .com crash too, and so but data, it's interesting seeing, I think, how popular data is now, but then I look back, then I kind of look at where the field is, and I'm like, well, as a field, as an aggregate, like what have we actually accomplished over the last 10 years? The same questions we've asked back then are still being asked today. Do I get value from this data, and is the data right? Is it believable?
Yeah.
Those are the two things.
Data quality is still crippling so many initiatives too. Yeah, to your point about spending 80-90% of time cleaning, you bring up a ton of points, Joe. I think I thought of like 5 questions, so I forgot 4 of them.
Feel free to ask them.
Yeah, man. No, this is great. I think I actually used to be part of a small consultancy, sort of analytics as a service, really early Snowflake, really early Looker.
Nice.
And super fun projects, really hard to convince, because when it's a consultancy, right, and you're like, we're bringing this heavy powered stack and it's expensive for us to maintain and run as an instance for a customer or a client, they look at the dollar sign and they ask that question right up front before they sign the check, right? Which is a bit different than it being run internally, right?
Sorry, you cut out in the last or something happened. Yeah. I didn't get the last 20 seconds
That's all right.
of what
We'll
you
cut
said.
it at 12 minutes.
No worries.
And then I'll start hearing again in a second.
Okay.
Yeah. Jumping back in. So, when you're offering like a data stack as a service, insights as a service, if you will, the cost of the data stack, it's on the contract to sign with us, right? And so the question, what's the ROI, was the upfront of every conversation.
Yep.
And I saw firsthand how when we go after smaller companies or smaller impact potentials, it didn't even make sense to spend on analysis, just basically, right? But then we'd go sit with the CMO of Whole Foods, and there's huge things that could be done there, right?
Yeah.
I think the data scientist as eye candy is a pretty provocative phrase, but I can't disagree, right? Like I've been in situations where data scientists have been frankly misused, particularly having been a marketer.
Yeah.
There's nothing a data scientist can do for B2B marketing unless you're a massive ad spend, or you need a mix model, right? Like you need some really good excuses, but there are good places for it, right? Like product usage analytics seems ripe for experimentation. maybe hopefully by this point we would have baked some more templates for usage events, right? And
Yeah.
we haven't, though, so warehouse and analytics stack is still the way to do it, right?
Well, I mean, what's interesting is, the rise of, I would say, the quote modern data stack, along with the rise of just, I think, a lot of people into the field. What that means is you have a lot of tools that are seemingly easy to use, and they certainly are, and they're certainly cheap if you know how to use them, to some degree. What I find though is there's because there's people don't have the experience or the history. There's a lot of reinvention of the wheel in a lot of cases. And I would say a lot of I would say things almost being done backwards in some sense, because again, you don't have the context of maybe how things were done prior. But it's not like marketing is a new thing in the world. Marketing's been around for a really long time, right? Advertising has been around for, I don't even know how long, a long time. But but it feels like with a lot of new entrants, what seems to be missing is like the domain expertise part. Right. So if you're hired as a data scientist to go work in a marketing and maybe come up with a marketing mix model, for example, well, I mean, you may have the maybe the raw tools, the raw skill set to do this, perhaps, right? So quote data science skills, whatever those are, but you certainly will need to catch up on the domain expertise. But then it's a cold start problem, it seems, because I would say somebody who comes at this from a marketing perspective and then picks up like data science skills would actually have a much stronger impact on the business because they sort of know what the outcome needs to be, versus you come with essentially just raw tactical skills, and then you're trying to figure out the domain. It's sort of a mixed bag. But what I see over and over again, and I had a consultancy too, and it's over. You go to these companies, and some people figure it out, but in a lot of cases, it's basic questions you would know to ask from day one about a domain. People are just like, well, how do you're basically trying to apply the math instead of understanding the problem you're trying to solve. And this is not the same thing.
Yeah.
So
you're totally right. And there's also the component where, because you have to string so many easy to use, cheap to start tools together, you actually end up spending most of your time keeping the tech stack working rather than analyzing data in a way that's meaningful.
Yeah.
The one thesis I have, Joe, I'd be curious your take on is, a lot of the data team concepts started under the product team because of usage events, right? And, we're software companies, so we should analyze the way people are using our software. And that makes sense to me, right? Brings up the point still of like, how much do you reinvent the wheel on user events, right? I'm sure there are some standardizations out there that are great, but then the C-level wants to understand, hey, what's happening in my business? I've heard about these things called dashboards where I get to see what's happening in my business with my users and with my go-to-market. Who can help me get to a dashboard? And then the product data team takes it. Problem is, then it becomes a question of just yanking stuff out and even calling the go-to-market stack the source systems, even though those are customer experience just as much as the product is, right? Does that resonate with you?
It does. I think it's just, more systems available isn't a great thing. In fact, I prefer the old days when things were a lot simpler in some ways. But it is what it is, right? And so, the world is seemingly more complex, in a lot of ways. But complexity takes on a few angles, and there's nuance to complexity. There's I would say, organic complexity, which happens as a result of hopefully valuable things happening within your business, right? And then those complexities, are hopefully beneficial and have a feedback loop to help grow your business. There's also self-inflicted complexity, which often happens when you maybe are too smart for your own good and trying to overcomplicate things. And this is when these two things intersect, it becomes strange to try and disentangle the mess that is created. And so and ironically, it's very smart people that create this mess, right? And then you have to figure out how you're going to get out of this. And so then it's a question of, well, If you're trying to figure out how to like take apart a ticking time bomb, like which wire is it that I need to snap so this thing doesn't blow up. But
I wonder, Joe, how much we have to blame certain vendors in the early days, like Tableau, for over-promising value from a tool that required so much support to get to just charts and graphs. I mean, the cost, when I think about the like total cost of ownership for most basic dashboards, that's something cringeworthy to me, right?
oh yeah, well yeah, think of the amount of money you're spending on licensing, salaries, opportunity costs as well. So I call that total opportunity cost of ownership. But it's crazy. In fact, I'm about done with this book from Dave McComb. It's called Software Wasteland. I highly recommend it. It goes into basically why is it that we've been struggling as an industry with the same problems over and over again, and a lot of it is self-inflicted by vendors. I mean, but I wouldn't say it's not a problem for the vendors. This is maybe by design in some ways. And so, I'm not trying to get conspiratorial, but I mean,
interesting.
But it is true that vendors do like you to be locked into their services. And so, but then it's also, but he has an interesting point in the book where he looks at the cost of software and the cost of, just hardware. And over time that's gone down, right? Subsequently, the cost of services and salaries have gone up. And so it's an interesting dichotomy if you think about this, because you'd expect that the software would allow you to gain more productivity, and do more with less, which in some cases is certainly true. But in a lot of cases, what happens is you get staff bloat while you have, more and more seemingly inexpensive, easier to use tools. So it's an interesting paradox. Yeah.
Sacra, I don't know if you're familiar. They're a VC research hybrid. They published a really interesting article last September called the fat data layer in B2B SaaS, and they visualize it in a pretty simplistic way back in 2012, where you had, you've got your like automation and outreach engagement stack that's got email marketing in it, and your CMS and all that stuff, and your CRM and data stack is a tiny little sliver beneath it. And that's inverted now, where you have a very thin layer of tools that actually engage with the customer and a very thick layer of tools that support that engagement. And I think you could say the same of Teams, right? If you were to look at the number of customer-facing people 10 years ago in most, let's say, hyper-growth unicorns, right, 1,000, 1,500 people, versus non-customer-facing, right? Which means that the cost of customer interactions, engagement, satisfaction, and revenue have skyrocketed, and we're seeing that come home to roost. I think, frankly, right, with the current situation around
for sure,
cuts and layoffs.
Yeah, and I mean it's tragic to see, but this is part of the order of the universe, I suppose, and it is what it is. And so I've been through many of these things at this point. I'm a lot older than I look. It sucks to see it, but this is what happens when you had an era of again, cheap money carpet bombing the economy, and everybody with a bright idea gets a company or gets a job at a company that got a lot of money, and then so because I would look at a lot of these companies, a lot of the big tech companies especially. I'm like, wow, you have a lot of people. I remember a friend of mine at Google was saying they're hiring, I can't remember if it was must have been I don't know. He said 1,000 people a week, but I don't know. Maybe he's right. Maybe he exaggerates a lot. I don't know. But it was whatever he said. I was just like, what do they all do at the end of the day? Why do you need all these people? So, but that was just one of them, right? But you look at the number of job openings at these companies, and it's bananas. So but then of course you look at the PE ratios, the price to earnings ratios of a lot of these companies, and then you'd say, okay, so you're already expected to pull, if I take your price earnings ratios at face value, your earnings per share, if you even had them, right, they could be negative earnings, in which case wouldn't matter. But even so, say that it was, 20, 50, 100. Okay. So now I have 100 years I'm taking a claim. I'm taking a bet that it's going to take you 100 years for you for me to recoup those earnings, right? So I mean, if you look at it from that perspective, it's like there's a lot of assumptions baked in here.
Yeah.
Right.
Some pretty aggressive ones. Yeah.
You're going to have to grow really hard and for a really long time. But, and so I don't know, I tend to be a bit more conservative on things. So I just, that's one reason I probably didn't start a venture funded product company. You could see the writing on the wall. I mean, it wasn't like when everyone and their mother is like going out and starting a company, you're just like, well, I mean, is this a good time to start one or not? If you're lucky enough to get the exit, you certainly look like a genius. But when the rates come, start going back up again, I mean, it is
which
what
is
it
inevitable.
Is, so.
Yeah, and Joe, I think to bring it back to the data world, right? I've been at 2 hypergrowth unicorns where there were more than 40 data people who I would say were not focused on product analysis. They were focused on BI or, basically BI. And at both of these companies, 30 marketers, 40, 50 salespeople, and 1 go-to-market operations person who essentially was tasked with supporting them on tools, processes, and data.
Interesting.
And I see this a lot, frankly. And you actually see it if you go to LinkedIn Sales Navigator right now and you put in 50 to 1,000 employee size software industry, and you type in a variety of sales operations, marketing operations, revenue operations, et cetera. You have about 6,000 people in the US. If you flip that and change the same sample to look at data titles, analytics titles, BI titles, you have 41,000.
That's crazy.
Right? They made a bet.
Yeah.
I think the startup world made a big bet on, like you said, data's the oil, data analytics teams could bring us a lot. And I think the biggest problem I have with that is now I see so many people out there talking about like data contracts, but I've had this debate with a few. That does nothing for the go-to-market operations and efficiency. It's purely about making the warehouse cleaner. It doesn't actually help Salesforce, NetSuite, HubSpot, et cetera, be more productive for these teams that desperately need to operate efficiently.
It's an interesting observation. I mean, with data contracts, I'm good friends with the people who promote these, the contracts. So I'll stay out of the argument. In fact, I support, from a tactical level, I do support the notion of a contract. And I think it's a prerequisite to a lot of other things that will need to happen from a data infrastructure standpoint. But to your other point about lots of data scientists, what I had noticed as well was there was a tendency for companies to sort of, I guess, hire a bunch of data scientists and just mothball them because that made it look like they had a data science initiative, and then that made it easier to raise money because it's like, well, we're doing AI because we have all these data scientists, therefore, why wouldn't you give us more money? And so I thought that was really interesting. But to tie it back to what you're saying, there was definitely a misallocation of resources. I could tell where the data scientists were typically focused on. As you say, BA, which if BA is like, if it has like an outcome that helps, product, for example, then sure, I think that's awesome. But again, it's, you got to also look at it. What's the intention behind the hiring? And so it's an unknown, right? Because you couldn't go ask every single company, why'd you hire data scientists unless you did a survey, and they'd probably give you wrong answers anyway. So it wouldn't matter. So yeah, it's interesting.
I think a lot of times BI, at worst, there are definitely, like you said, great ways to use it. But if you think about the cost, opportunity cost of ownership, as you mentioned, the total cost of ownership, that dashboard better produce some multi-million-dollar outcome decisions, right? And ultimately, it sort of acts like an executive assistant in the form of charts and graphs for leaders.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, I think my friend Ollie Hughes he's from Count. He had a good point about dashboards where it's, after a while, the dashboard is there more to show the status quo, and then you would, in order to get value from a dashboard, it's like you would have to be prone to making a different decision in order for the dashboard to be useful to you, if you know what I mean, because that's the only thing that would trigger a new type of analysis is when you have a different question, which makes sense on the surface. The other facet of a dashboard is you can get dashboard fatigue as well, where you're so used to seeing things and the way they are that when something odd happens, hopefully you're paying attention to it. But most of the times when I've been doing reporting and dashboarding for ages, and back in the day, one thing we would do is just stop sending reports to people and see who notices, and you'd be surprised.
Control test, yeah.
Yeah, some people like it. Some people notice, and some people don't care. And at which point, you're like, I guess we don't need that one anymore. So
there's wisdom in that, right? I mean, it's no different than marketing tests, right?
Well, but I think you could play the same thing to data teams too. If you, I think that there's always the common trope that we need to add value as an industry, as a data industry. But the question I would have is if your data team disappeared, what would it matter? So
that's an interesting question, Joe. That's an interesting question. I'm curious. I've talked to a couple RevOps leaders who, in their past lives, in order to bridge the sort of like product data go-to-market ops chasm, brought data expertise onto their RevOps teams, BI engineers, data engineers, onto their RevOps teams, so that they could function right with data, high quality data, great insights. What can a head of data do to enable go-to-market efficiency right now?
Definitely tie yourself to the sales function if possible. I mean, where I've seen data be successful, it's when the feedback loop is short. It's tied to a tangible outcome. So that could be revenue, that could be supply chain, where it's like the cost of screwing up is pretty great. When the stakes are high, that's where data matters, right? And I can't think of a sales org in the world that wouldn't want analytics on its data, right? You'd be insane. Like, oh no, I can sort of intuit how sales are going to be. Like, nobody ever says that. They do, but right, you got to be able to back it up someday. And in fact, your gut instinct is usually validated or not by the outcome that you get in the form of a number. It's strange how that works. So, that to me is like where a data leader should tie themselves. And I was talking to somebody the other day, but it's like, the best outcomes for data are always those that are attached again to things that are just driving outcomes, and hopefully, in a way that where the feedback loop is really short. So you can iterate, right? Again, data is all about hypothesis, testing, reevaluating your assumptions and so forth, right? If it weren't, then you wouldn't need data professionals, because you could just, that'd be a heuristic. You can just program that, right? You need the ability to be flexible in your assumptions, and that's where I think that's the role that I used to be in back in the day. Was doing like sales, marketing, and operations. Data stuff, I suppose, right? And that helped drive the company forward, in a lot of ways. But again, we didn't call it data science back then. It was just like, you're just helping people. You're helping these functions operate better, right? That's a big difference. There wasn't there wasn't this like, huge fascination with, oh, it's a data person. It's like, you're just there to help. So I hope people just get back to basics like that, because that's again where that's where it matters.
Yeah. So. I think that's a great point. We just released our own visualization layer at Syncari, and I just saw a demo of cross-system outreach in Salesforce. So email sequence by revenue. I mean, what sales leader wouldn't want that? And there's no easy way for sales leaders to get that, right?
Yeah,
because
that's cool, right?
You have a tool that just shoots emails automatically to do sales at scale, and you have a tool that tracks revenue by opportunity by account, and getting those to talk to each other is hard. Great example with sales. I also think CS, right? Very underserved organization.
Yep, for sure.
CS operations is a rare title. If you can feed them product signals, right? If you can feed them with good insights, and also help the leadership understand if they're looking at cutting sales right now or cutting CS, what's the real impact of that, right? That's a difficult question to answer, but it also takes some serious data science, shall we say, to take a stab at it.
Yeah, and other areas I think data science can be effective too is if you're working in product and and the features you're working on are directly related to something a customer uses. Again, where I've seen it again, it just comes back to like tight feedback loops, associated with tangible outcomes. It's about as simple as it gets, and about that hard too, right? So,
yeah, because it takes focus, it takes alignment, it takes a bias towards efficiency with outcomes. Yeah, Joe, this has been super fun. I think we can go ahead and wrap. You had a lot of great nuggets, some definitely hot takes, but as an author, I guess you're allowed to have those strong perspectives.
No, I only have lukewarm takes, and it's been a fun chat. It's a good podcast. Good guest so far. So wish you the best of luck with it. It's cool.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Thanks for coming on, and we'll wrap. Thank you for listening to the Distributed Truth Podcast. Check out our other episodes, or visit Syncari.com to learn more about unified customer data. That's SYNCARI, Syncari.com. Thank you, and have a great day.